And here Paul gets to his famous preference, and this is the one I mentioned last week. I've never preached this passage in a wedding for reasons you'll see in a moment. Somebody want to read it out?
Alan, I will.
Yes, good.
Sandy, to the unmarried and the widows, I say that it is good for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion.
All right. So you have here Paul's very romantic view. Marriage is for those who cannot abstain, right? Who aren't gifted with celibacy. And we'll get to this later also in the chapter because he sounds it out here and then he goes to a lot of different other permutations, but then he comes back in 17 through 38. And I want you to turn to that in your Bible, and I'm just going to summarize here how he argues for celibacy and singleness and virginity. He begins in 17 by describing a general principle that he hopes they will keep among themselves. He says, in light of the fact that the time may be short, and this somebody asked last week about the apocalypse and how much timeline did Paul see happening in the world? Was Paul buying green bananas? Was he looking out for a long term ministry, or was he thinking the second coming was imminent? And here he says, we don't know really. So why don't you just stay in the same state in which you were called? So if you were circumcised when you were called, stay circumcised. If you were uncircumcised when you were called, stay uncircumcised. If you were a slave when you were called, stay a slave. If you were free when called, stay free. And I give these two because Paul uses them as analogies or illustrations not because he goes long on them. I don't think he cares about them, actually. I think he's trying to set up what's next, which is if you were a virgin, if you were single, when you got called to Christ, remember the opening line of the letter is to the people of Christ in Corinth called to be saints, right? We got that kletos, Greek word kletos, that means called. So when you were called, Paul is saying, if you were single when you were called, stay single. If you were married, stay married. And in that, he says, if you marry now, if you don't take my advice and stay in the same state, if you marry now, it's not a sin. Marriage isn't recommended, but it's not going to count against you in the great yonder, right? Um, and here are the two reasons he gives why marriage would be better to avoid than to engage in or move toward. The first is that it produces anxiety. um, he starts out with it produces anxieties as in troubles, and then he moves to it divides attention because he as a single guy can just focus on the Lord, but a non-single person has to focus on the partner, and that splits the allegiance or splits the attention at least. And so Paul is going to come back and, Sandy just read a very brief it's better to marry than to burn with lust, but I wish you could all be as I am, right? The end of the chapter goes long on that. So Paul really wants to drive home the superiority of celibacy, the superiority of singleness, and he spends a lot of time on it in this chapter. It's another thing I'm going to ask him about when I meet him someday. But here's the deal. Paul's criteria are about the gospel. And he looks around him and sees that he has more time and freedom to do whatever the call entails than his married brothers and sisters as he observes them. Right? We know he worked with Priscilla and Aquila in Corinth. We know that later in chapter 9, he's going to say, you know, Peter has a wife, and people pay for both of them, and all of those things. Um, we know that he's aware of pastors, of missionaries, of whatever we're going to call them, of agents of the gospel who are married, and his observations, at least, have made him very glad that he is free and not encumbered. Right? This has become throughout history. It has some part in the celibacy of the clergy in certain orders and in the Roman Catholic Church. Um, but it can be interpreted in a way that goes where Paul goes with it, which is if something gets in my way as a gospel guy, some somewhere he says, "Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel." Right? If something has a chance to get in my way as a gospeler, I'm not going to do it. And so we could imagine for a moment, we could imagine a situation in which somebody in the Corinthian congregation comes to Paul and says, "You know, Paul, we completely get you on that singleness thing, but we're not marrying because we can't handle it uh, sexually to be apart. We're marrying because it gets us into contexts to spread the gospel that we wouldn't get into if we weren't married. There have been missionaries through the ages who have had better access as married people than as single people, for instance. And I'm posing this as a hypothetical because I want us to focus in on why Paul doesn't like marriage. It's not a sort of he doesn't see it as an evil enterprise. He sees it as a potential distraction, and for him, something to be avoided if marriage becomes an enhancer of someone's mission or ministry. I believe that Paul would answer, and this is hypothetical, and I'm going to ask him someday, but I believe that Paul would answer back, if it's getting the gospel forward, I want it for you. Right? Now, motives are all kinds of mix. But I think we ought to focus on the thing that makes Paul like singleness and celibacy here. It's not the evil of sex itself. It's not the evil of male-female continuing relationships. It's not the evil of continuing relationships. And we talked for a moment last week about the ongoing conversation about homosexuality in the Bible. If there's a whole other hatch here that could open if two people of same sex uh, relationship came and said, "This is making our ministry more powerful." You see that I want us to focus on the very center of why Paul makes the decisions he makes rhetorically here. He wants nothing to get in the way of the gospel. Philippians. In Philippians, he's sitting in prison and unable to go out and preach. So he starts converting the guards who are assigned to watch him. That's how gospeling Paul is. And as he does that, he's also hearing that there are preachers out there who are preaching from bad motive. And he says, you know what? Let them go. The gospel is going out. In that I rejoice. Paul's central call in life is to move the gospel of Jesus into as many spaces as he can. He senses a call to the Gentiles, but we know he talked to the synagogues. We know that he talked to gatherings of Jewish people. Paul was about moving the gospel into the world. Here, he only doesn't like marriage when it gets in the way of that. Does that make sense? Now, that's not a brief against celibate clergy. It's just to say, if we're going to understand Paul, we need to understand the centrality of gospeling for him. It was his whole life. Anything that got in the way of it was not okay with him.